Although they are illegal in many countries, objects used by Nazi leaders during their regime have become a cult favorite for many collectors around the world. While most of the artifacts, weapons, and documents recovered during the war are now part of public institutions or museums, there is a deep black market for memorabilia and objects linked to men like Hitler, Himmler, and Goering that generates millions of dollars in illegal auctions. This has led many states to intensify their hunt for these objects and many treasure hunters to try to get ahead of them. What really happened to the Nazi regime's most prized objects, such as the Blutfahne flag or Hermann's luxurious marshal's baton? Goering? Hermann's marshal's baton, Goering, Hermann Field, Marshal's baton Goering, head of the German Air Force and one of the highest-ranking Nazis. The baton or staff of command originates from the staff awarded to the Roman consuls, which represented supreme command over each of the staffs of command of the Roman tribes that made up the Roman people. Over time, these were extended to the Roman legates with civil and military authority in the provinces of the empire. Although there are also earlier records dating back to the time of classical Greece, Hitler was to Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg. The handle of this cane was covered in light blue velvet. It is currently housed in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Hitler then handed the 1st Air Force baton to Hermann Goering after his promotion to Field Marshal. Although its design was similar to the Blomberg cane with a light blue velvet shaft, it incorporated the symbols of the Air Force balcony cross. In addition, the end caps were encrusted with numerous small diamonds. It is currently housed in the National Infantry Museum at Fort Moore, Georgia. In the summer of 1940, 3 Air Force batons were issued. They were covered in blue velvet and were in the design of the balcony cross, differing only in the individual inscriptions on the ends. Another baton of this style was issued in 1943. The 1940 Air Force batons were slightly more expensive to manufacture than the 1940 Army batons. The single additional Naval Command baton was issued to Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. It had a blue velvet shaft and incorporated a U-boat symbol at one end. It is currently in the Shropshire Regiment Museum, Shrewsbury, UK, and was donated by Major General J.B. Churcher, who captured Dönitz at the end of the war and took the baton. But among all these batons that Hitler gave, one stood out. It was the only Reichsmarschall's baton, which was given to Hermann Goering when he received the title of the only Reich Marshal, the highest rank in the military, at a promotion ceremony held at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin on July 19, 1940. While its appearance was similar to the other walking sticks of the 1940s, what differentiated it was its intrinsic value, as it incorporated exceptional materials in addition to the typical precious ones. The handle was white elephant ivory, not velvet-covered metal. The end caps incorporated platinum on the inscription band and over 600 small diamonds. The cane was made for a value that would be equivalent to approximately 150,000 euros today, a small fortune. It is probably one of the most coveted objects by the great collectors of Nazi memorabilia because it is a unique and irreplaceable object. However, it was confiscated by the Allies and is currently protected and on display at the United States Army West Point Museum in Highland Falls, New York. Totenkopf, the SS skull rings that collectors love, the SS Ring of Honor, better known as the Skull Ring, was a decoration of the Schutzstaffel. However, it was not an official recognition by the state, but a personal gift given by Heinrich Himmler himself to distinguished members of the SS. It became a highly coveted decoration, unsaleable, and even during Nazism, forged replicas were manufactured. The skull ring was initially issued to senior officers of the SS Old Guard, of whom there were fewer than 5,000. It was later extended to all SS members who graduated from the Junkers schools and other SS training centers. Each ring had the recipient's name, the date of award, and Himmler's signature engraved on the inside. The ring included a standard letter from Himmler with a generalized message but clarifying that it was to be worn only on the left hand on the ring finger. In the letter, according to Himmler, the ring was a reminder at all times to be ready to risk our lives for the lives of all. As the SS spread, many failed to obtain the ring, so some SS and police members commissioned local jewelers to make unofficial versions. If a member of the SS was dismissed or retired from service, his ring was to be returned. In 1938, Himmler ordered the return of all rings of deceased SS men and officers to be kept in a chest at Wawelsburg Castle. This was to be a memorial symbolizing the deceased's continued membership in the SS order. The ring's symbolism reflected Himmler's interest in Germanic mysticism and includes the Totenkopf symbol related to the death cult and the Armanen runes related to Germanic paganism. The ring was designed by Karl Maria Willigut, an Austrian occultist with manufacturing in charge of the Otto and Carolina family jewelry store Gar of Munich. A sig rune to the left and right of the skull, framed by a triangle, represents the power of the sun and conquering energy. A Hagal rune represents the faith and camaraderie idealized by the organization's leaders. The esoteric meaning of the Hagal rune, according to Guido, was, "Enclose the universe within yourself and you will control it." Other runes related to protection from evil and salvation, and the classic swastika completed the iconography engraved on the ring. Over the years, rings with other runes and various symbols have been found, but it is believed that these were either replicas made by local smiths at the request of officers who did not receive them from Himmler, or even replicas created in the post-war period. In October 1944, Himmler ordered the manufacture and awarding of the ring to stop, and all remaining rings, approximately 11,500, to be sealed in a hill near Wewelsburg. By January 1945, 64% of the 14,500 rings manufactured had been returned to Himmler after the deaths of their wearers. In addition, 10% had been lost on the battlefield and 26% were either in the hands of their wearers or their whereabouts were unknown. The SS leader's exact motives for making these decisions are unknown, but it is believed that the rings were part of his own lodge, which he wanted to impose behind Hitler's back, and which he regretted in the face of the fall of the regime. The Spear of Destiny, Hitler's most desired object. Among the many objects shrouded in mythology, symbolism, and mystery in the history of Nazism, few have captured the popular imagination like the so-called Spear of Destiny. This relic, also known as the Spear of Longinus, was believed to be the weapon with which the Roman centurion Longinus pierced Jesus' side during the crucifixion. In the esoteric worldview fostered by some high-ranking Nazis, the spear represented much more than a religious object. It was an artifact of power, a magical tool that granted dominion over the world to its possessor. This idea was particularly appealing to Adolf Hitler, who developed a deep fascination with it during his youth in Vienna and once in power made it a symbol of his imperial destiny. During the years leading up to World War I, the young Hitler spent many hours in the Imperial Treasury Museum in Vienna's Hofburg, where the spear was displayed alongside other relics of the Holy Roman Empire. It was there, according to some sources, that Hitler had an almost mystical experience before the object and came to believe it possessed a power that he could channel for his political and spiritual ends. Although these claims lack solid documentary evidence, they reflect the way in which myth became intertwined with real history. When Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, one of his first orders of business was to move the Spear of Destiny to Nuremberg, the city he considered the symbolic heart of the Third Reich. Along with other pieces of imperial treasure, the spear was placed in an underground vault beneath St. Lawrence Church, protected against Allied bombing. In its new location, the relic was not just a collector's item, it was treated as a kind of political talisman. For the Nazi propaganda apparatus, its possession reinforced the narrative of continuity between the Millennial Reich and the new Aryan Empire. However, as the war drew to a close and the Reich crumbled, the Nazis' hidden treasures began to disperse. In April 1945, American troops entering Nuremberg discovered the spear along with the rest of the Holy Roman Empire's treasure. The find was made by an army detachment led by Lieutenant Walter Horn, an exiled German art historian, now part of the Office of Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives, also known as the Monuments Men. Walter Horn possessed exceptional knowledge of European art history and understood the symbolic value of the spear. It was thanks to him that the spear was preserved, catalogued, and returned to Vienna in 1946, where it was once again housed in the imperial treasury. The return of the spear to Austria was not only an operation of cultural restitution, but also a gesture intended to sever any symbolic link between the remnants of Nazism and imperial symbols. Since then, the Spear of Destiny has remained in Austrian custody. Although it has been the subject of multiple conspiracy theories, historical and scientific studies have determined that the spear likely dates from a period after Christ, and that its connection to Longinus is purely legendary. However, its value as a political and cultural symbol remains undiminished. It has appeared in novels, films, and esoteric works, perpetuating the idea that Hitler sought in it an instrument of mystical domination. Today, the spear remains behind glass in the Hofburg Palace. It is no longer an emblem of conquest, but an ambiguous relic, fraught with a murky past and multiple meanings. Its history between legend and fact illustrates how objects can be turned into vehicles of ideology and how their subsequent fate reveals the efforts to strip them of that symbolic power. What was once considered an instrument of imperial power is today simply a museum piece. The other Alexandria. What happened to Hitler's personal library? Few objects can offer such intimate access to the mind of a historical figure as their personal library. In the case of Adolf Hitler, his book collection reveals not only his ideological obsessions but also his insecurities, cultural aspirations, and personal contradictions. Despite projecting himself as an enemy of traditional intellectualism, Hitler was a compulsive reader. It is estimated that his personal library housed between 6,000 and 16,000 volumes, many of them underlined, annotated, or marked with bookmarks. After the collapse of the Third Reich, these books became cultural plunder, analytical artifacts, and in some cases historical trophies. Hitler's intellectual formation was chaotic and self-taught. After leaving high school without graduating and failing to enter the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, Hitler spent years living in precarious conditions, first in Vienna and then in Munich. During this time, he found in books a way to structure his thinking. He read voraciously about German history, politics, mythology, architecture, and racial theory. His library during this period was modest but significant. It included works such as Henry Ford's The International Jew, books by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, pan-Germanist pamphlets, and essays on classical art and German Romanticism. Once in power, Hitler continued to accumulate books at a dizzying pace. His library was scattered among his residences, the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, his mountain retreat at the Berghof, and his apartment in Munich. The works were organized not according to academic criteria, but rather thematic, often mixing classical literature with pseudo-scientific treatises. His favorite authors included Goethe, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, although his interpretation of these thinkers was selective and utilitarian. He also owned multiple editions of Mein Kampf, as well as works written by members of his inner circle and by Nazi ideologues. One of the most disturbing aspects of his collection was its volume of books on religion, esotericism, and the occult. Although Hitler claimed to despise mysticism, his library included titles on astrology, secret societies, Germanic runes, and pagan symbology. These texts reflect the ideological climate that surrounded him, where racial theories were combined with reinvented Aryan mythologies to legitimize the supremacy of the German people. Similarly, the library included archaeological studies, books on expeditions to India and Tibet, and texts attempting to trace the supposed Atlantean roots of Aryan civilization. As the Third Reich began to crumble in the final years of World War II, Hitler ordered the safekeeping of many of his personal belongings. Parts of his library were moved to air raid shelters and secret depots in southern Germany and Austria. However, after the fall of Berlin in 1945, many of these works were confiscated by the Allies, especially the Americans and Soviets, as part of the operation to recover and document the Nazi cultural apparatus. Some of these books were stored as evidence. Others were distributed among libraries, and several simply disappeared or ended up in private collections. A considerable portion of Hitler's books at the Berghof were discovered by American troops who occupied the site. Many of these volumes were taken to the United States and ended up in institutions such as the Library of Congress. There, some 1,200 books belonging to Hitler are still preserved under special conditions. Many of these copies retain personal markings, underlining, marginal notes, signatures, or the bookplate with his name engraved on it. This set of books has been the subject of scholarly research seeking to understand the evolution of Hitler's thinking as well as the types of sources that informed his worldview. In parallel, the Soviet Union also appropriated part of the Nazi cultural archive, and it is suspected that some of Hitler's books were taken to Moscow, although the exact fate of many pieces remains uncertain. The dispersed nature of his library makes a complete reconstruction difficult. Some researchers have spent decades trying to locate the lost volumes, tracing their appearance at auctions or in university libraries. Hitler's personal library has thus become a historical puzzle, partially preserved but incomplete. Evil Metal: The Fate of Hitler's Stunning Mercedes-Benz. Among the luxuries Hitler enjoyed as leader of the Nazi Party were the finest cars Germany could produce, Mercedes-Benz. To this day, they remain among the most elegant and well-designed automobiles in the world. The relationship between Hitler and the automaker would last nearly 2 decades, and the team would produce numerous vehicles and other equipment for the German war effort. Hitler used a total of 5 open-top 770K saloon cars for his entourage in Germany. However, the Führer himself traveled in a fairly protected, hardtop car. The fact that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914 while traveling in an open-top car may have influenced Hitler to always use closed Mercedes-Benz sedans unless he was showing off in a parade. This precaution was confirmed after the assassination of General Reinhard Heydrich in Prague in 1942 in an open-top car, after which Hitler ordered 20 MBZ 540K armoured sedans. Hitler had already opted for heavily armoured limousines and had previously ordered 2 more 770K models. The 770K model was known as the Grosser Mercedes Offener Tourenwagen. With its 7,655 cubic centimetre straight-8 engine, single overhead camshaft and twin carburetors, generating 230 horsepower when the supercharger was activated, the vehicle could reach 193 kilometers per hour, 120 miles per hour, despite weighing 4,500 kilograms, 10,800 pounds. Its enormous weight was due in part to the additional 6mm armor on the floor and 3mm on the doors, as well as 40mm thick bulletproof glass. There were 3 folding seats behind the driver's seat, allowing the car to seat a total of 9 people. Fully upholstered in leather, it had a 5-inch raised floor on the right side to make Hitler appear taller when standing. The front seat folded back to give him more room while standing. The car had a 51-gallon gas tank and a range of 150 miles, but could achieve 3 miles per gallon in the city. The car also featured 4-wheel independent leaf spring suspension, dual-system power brakes, and 8.25 by 17-inch tires. Hitler ordered another fully enclosed Mercedes 770K in 1943, fitted with an armor-reinforced steel roof in addition to the rest of the armor and amenities of his earlier cars. Hitler wanted to convey to the world the superiority of German engineering. At that time, Germany was lagging behind in motorization. Hitler promised the German people that he would rapidly develop the automotive industry and initiated a program of rapid construction of the Autobahn network, the first of which opened in May 1935. With government support, Mercedes-Benz doubled its production from 6,000 cars in 1932 to 12,000 in 1934. By 1935, that number had more than doubled, reaching 25,000. While the exact number of 770,000 armoured cars manufactured by the German company is unknown, other high-ranking Nazis, such as Göring, Himmler and Goebbels, did have their own models at their disposal. Of these cars, 3 were found: Göring's Blue Goose, named after its paint colour, Himmler's 770K limousine, and Hitler's 770K, the latter 2 of which are currently on display in museums for viewing. Himmler's infamous and beautifully engraved weapons recovered World War II artifacts, especially those belonging to or closely associated with Nazi leaders, are often cult objects for certain history buffs and collectors with ties to fascist ideologies. Among the most coveted items are Heinrich Himmler's curious pistols. These weren't the pistols he actually used, as most Nazis, especially toward the end of the war, carried whatever weapons were available. Rather, they were handguns that were created as recognition or special gifts for prominent SS officers. First, we must mention the famous Sauer 38H, signed by Heinrich Himmler. These target pistols were produced during the final years of the Nazi regime, before the war effort forced them to scale back their weapons production. Known to collectors as the J.P. Sauer and Sohn Heinrich Himmler Model 38H, it is an extremely rare pistol and was used in shooting competitions. Supposedly, these pistols were issued to German snipers who achieved 100 confirmed kills, like a more brutal version of the Pour le Mérite medal. While it is believed that about 100 of these pistols were made, only 5 examples are known, and one of those was captured from Hitler's home in Berchtesgaden, which he also reportedly received as a gift from the head of the SS. Some of the recovered models have been auctioned off, with recent public sales fetching over $80,000. In terms of its technical specifications, this exclusive Model 38 has a high-gloss blue finish with the presentation inscription on the left side of the slide. The left side of the slide bears the inscription Dem Scharfschützen, followed by an engraved facsimile signature H. Himmler, indicating that each weapon represented the favor of the Reichsführer SS. The right side of the slide bears the standard late production two-line factory legend J.P. Sauer and Sohn, Sul, Cal, 7.65 inches, found on the opposite side of standard production pistols. The slide is internally numbered to match the frame, and the pistol has checkered black plastic grips with the Sauer monogram in a circle on the left grip. While at first glance it looks like an ordinary small pistol, Himmler's engraved signature and the minor differences from the common Sauer .38 make the weapon a highly sought-after item for shooters and collectors, and thousands of replicas are sold online today. However, the Sauer 38 was not the most exclusive pistol to bear Himmler's signature. That place went to the Walter P.P.H. Himmler, a hand-engraved and handcrafted pistol intended to be worn as a decoration or insignia by important Nazi figures or prominent SS officers. These weapons varied over the years, some with a type of work similar to Hitler's famous golden pistol, while others were engraved on one profile with inscriptions on the other profile, in addition to having details and decorations that could vary. Either way, and taking into account the models that were recovered or captured after the war, historians have confirmed that the pistols themselves are authentic masterpieces of Walter engraving, and all bear the engraved facsimile of the H. Himmler signature. Of course, to this day it is very difficult to find original versions of these weapons, and the vast majority are replicas with varying levels of craftsmanship or quality. Those few have been sold to private collectors for tens of thousands of dollars and are sometimes displayed in museums or displays of historical weapons. The music that calmed the beast, Ava Browns' personal piano. Ava Browns' personal piano is one of the most emblematic objects of the intimate atmosphere that surrounded Adolf Hitler at his Alpine residence, the Berghof. Ava Braun, Hitler's partner since the 1930s, was an ambiguous figure, officially and publicly kept on the fringes of power, but in practice very close to the nerve center of the regime. The Berghof, in the Bavarian Alps, functioned as their shared refuge, a place of rest and isolation for the Nazi elite. There, Eva attempted to reproduce a bourgeois lifestyle that included musical evenings, home movies, walks, and private celebrations. In this context, the piano became a central object of entertainment and everyday life. It was a high-quality upright piano manufactured by the Bluthner House, one of the most prestigious in Germany. The instrument, made of dark wood, had marquetry details and a warm tone, ideal for the small rooms of the Berghof. Although Ava Braun was not a professional pianist, she used to play popular pieces of the time, waltzes and simple compositions that enlivened the evenings at the residence. Several photographs and testimonials from Berghof attendees, such as the photographer Heinrich Hoffmann or the secretary Traudl Junger, mention the piano as part of the main hall's standard decor. Besides Ava, other visitors made use of the piano, including members of Hitler's inner circle, such as Albert Speer, who was fond of classical music. Although Hitler had no musical training, he was deeply sensitive to music and valued it as a means of nationalist exaltation. However, Ava's piano served a different function, not as a symbol of German culture, but as a vehicle for intimacy, escape, and enforced normality in the midst of horror. With the fall of the Third Reich in 1945, the Berghof was bombed and looted like many other Nazi properties. Ava Braun's piano was one of the objects taken as a trophy by Allied soldiers. It is known that a US Army unit transported the instrument out of Germany, and after several years of disappearance, the piano reappeared in the United Kingdom in the hands of a private collector. In the 2010s, it was put up for sale at auction by a British auction house, sparking a wave of criticism regarding the sale of personal belongings of Nazi figures. The instrument was eventually acquired by an anonymous buyer, and its exact whereabouts have remained unknown ever since. Bourgeois vices. Where is Hitler's gold tea service? Among the most curious objects that survived the decline of the Third Reich is the golden tea service that belonged to Adolf Hitler. This luxury porcelain set, made by the prestigious Meissen factory, is one of the most representative pieces of the duality between the austere image the dictator projected and the ostentatious environment that surrounded him in private. Hitler was known for promoting a public image of sobriety and self-control. He did not smoke, rarely drank alcohol, and portrayed himself as a man of simple habits. However, his private life, particularly at the Berghof, his residence in the Bavarian Alps, belied this construct. There, surrounded by luxury and comfort, he received guests, organized informal meetings, and cultivated a carefully staged atmosphere of power. In this environment, the golden tea service played a symbolic role. It represented not only his position, but also his vision of an eternal, refined, and dominant Reich. The service was manufactured in the 1930s and consisted of a dozen cups, saucers, jugs, teapots, and teaspoons, all with gilt rims, neoclassical decorations, and the imperial eagle emblem engraved alongside the initials AAH. Its use was reserved for high-level private gatherings. Ava Browns, Hitler's close companion, frequently hosted afternoon teas at the Berghof where this china set was used, suggesting that beyond public discourse, a luxurious lifestyle carefully contained within the private sphere was cultivated within the Nazi regime's leadership. At the end of the war, many of Hitler's belongings were looted or requisitioned by Allied soldiers. The Berghof was bombed in April 1945 by British aircraft and subsequently looted by American troops and local civilians. It was in this context that the tea service was broken up and its pieces dispersed. Some of them ended up in the hands of soldiers as war souvenirs. Others appeared decades later at private auctions, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom. The appearance of these pieces on the market generated controversy. On the one hand, there are those who consider them historical objects with documentary value. On the other, there is fear that they could become objects of fetishism or cultism by neo-Nazi groups. Museums and institutions have chosen to approach the subject with caution. Some pieces were acquired for research, others were rejected for ethical reasons. In symbolic terms, the tea service represents one of the great paradoxes of Nazism, a regime that proclaimed itself the enemy of bourgeois decadence, but in practice reproduced its most elitist forms. While millions of people were persecuted, deported, or murdered, the leaders of the Third Reich surrounded themselves with luxuries that contrasted brutally with the suffering they caused. Today, pieces from Hitler's gold tea service continue to occasionally emerge in private collections or at auction houses. Each one carries a historical weight that is difficult to ignore. These are objects that, due to their apparent banality, may seem harmless, but in reality they condense the contradiction between the public discourse of Nazism and its private practice of power. The sword and the serpent. What happened to the SS ceremonial swords? In addition to the mysterious skull rings, SS officers also received expensive swords and daggers as official recognition of their exploits or line of duty. The SS honor sword was a straight dress sword worn with the SS uniform between 1935 and 1945. First introduced in 1935, the SS sword was designed by Karl Diebitsch, Heinrich Himmler's personal advisor on art and design within the SS. The weapon had a long, slender, straight blade manufactured in varying lengths to suit the wielder's height. The hilt of the degen featured a D-shaped knuckle bow and a black, grooved wooden grip. The grip was bound with silver wire and featured an inset disc bearing the SS runes in a straight lightning bolt pattern. The scabbard was painted with black enamel and featured decorative silver mounts on the top and bottom. It was usually used with a braided aluminum knot adorned with the SS runes in black on the handle. The officer's sword was officially awarded with a certificate hand-signed by Himmler to select SS officers in recognition of special merit. It was also awarded to officers graduating from SS officer training centers. The non-commissioned officer version was similar to the officer version, but lacked the silver decorations, reflecting their lower rank. There was also a special version with a blade made of Damascus, an exquisite alloy famous for its grained surface and extreme durability. These swords were extremely rare, as Himmler personally awarded them to a select few, usually high-ranking SS officers or important businessmen or statesmen holding an honorary rank of at least SS Oberfuhrer. Since they were usually presented to recipients on their 50th birthday, they were also known as birthday honor swords. The few recovered examples of these swords demonstrate that they were made from the highest quality materials, and on the black market for Nazi artifacts, they are considered a valuable rarity. Today, ceremonial swords are among the most sought-after items among Nazi memorabilia aficionados, although the vast majority of swords on the market are replicas made by craftsmen after the end of World War II. Dressed to kill, the fate of the Nazi leaders' dress uniforms. Within the symbolic apparatus of the Third Reich, uniforms played a crucial role. More than simple clothing, they were carefully designed propaganda elements to project power, order, hierarchy, and mysticism. The full dress uniforms of Nazi leaders were highly tailored pieces that conveyed the regime's authoritarian aesthetic and contributed to its theatricalization of power. Today, many of these uniforms have survived as museum objects, war trophies, or collector's items, and their fate raises complex ethical and cultural questions. The design of these uniforms was meticulously planned. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, personally commissioned the creation of a uniform that evoked Prussian discipline and, at the same time, the aura of an esoteric order. To achieve this, they turned to designers such as Karl Diebitsch and the renowned tailor Hugo Boss, whose company produced much of the official Nazi party attire. The result was precisely cut black uniforms with silver details, runic insignia, leather belts, and high boots that gave their wearers an imposing and ritualized image. His leaders owned multiple versions of their uniforms: combat, work, representative, and dress uniforms. The latter were worn at official events, parades, diplomatic receptions, or party celebrations. They were more ornate than service uniforms, with embroidery, medals, sashes, sabers, and decorations. In many cases, they were unique, custom-made pieces that displayed the wearer's rank and achievements. The obsession with hierarchy and visual distinction was an integral part of the Nazi cult of power. With the end of the war, thousands of these uniforms were confiscated by the Allies, especially by American and Soviet troops. Some were seized as evidence at the Nuremberg trials, while others were kept as souvenirs by soldiers or even resold on the black market. Some ended up in military museums in Europe and North America, such as the Imperial War Museum in London, or the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where they are displayed under strict educational frameworks. However, the trade and collection of Nazi uniforms remains a controversial topic. In countries like Germany, the public display of Nazi symbols is severely restricted, so many uniforms are stored off-screen or presented without emblems. Elsewhere, they have appeared in private auctions, generating controversy due to the high prices they fetch and the profile of some collectors. The fetishism surrounding these objects has been harshly criticized, as it risks trivializing or aestheticizing the horror of the Nazi regime. Some specific dress uniforms have particular stories. Hermann's white dress uniform, Göring's uniform, for example, was one of the regime's most striking pieces. Made of high-quality fabric and laden with medals, this uniform was recovered by American troops and has been displayed in traveling exhibitions about Nazism. Others, such as Himmler's dress uniform, have been the subject of legal disputes between collectors and museums over their provenance or their use in film productions. Origin of evil. What happened to Alfred Rosenberg's secret file? Among the most valuable documents of the Third Reich's ideological apparatus was the secret personal archive of Alfred Rosenberg, a key figure in the construction of Nazi racist and expansionist thought. An intellectual of the regime, minister of the occupied Eastern Territories and leading theorist of the Nazi New Order, Rosenberg accumulated over the years a monumental archive of texts, memoranda, letters, decrees, and manuscripts that documented not only his thinking but also the policies of occupation, Germanization, and cultural plunder implemented in Eastern Europe. The archive was both personal and institutional. Rosenberg not only wrote and collected racist and anti-Semitic ideas, but also headed the Einsatzstab, Reichsleiter Rosenberg, a unit charged with the systematic plundering of libraries, archives, museums, and private collections in the occupied territories. As Nazi troops advanced, the ERR seized thousands of books, works of art, religious and scientific documents, which were sent to Berlin to support the construction of a large center for ideological studies planned by Rosenberg. At the end of the war, the archive was hidden. With the defeat of the Third Reich imminent, many of the regime's figures sought to destroy or disseminate evidence of their crimes. However, the Rosenberg archive was located by American soldiers in 1945 in a salt mine in Hungen near Frankfurt, where the Nazis had stored a vast amount of looted documents and artifacts. There, among tons of papers and cultural property, was this unique archive covering everything from plans for the Germanization of Ukraine to directives on religious persecution in the occupied territories. The discovery was considered of enormous value by the Allies. The archive was transferred to the United States as part of the so-called documentation project promoted by the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. For decades, it remained in the hands of the U.S. government, safeguarded by the Hoover institution at Stanford University, and used as a source for academic and judicial research. However, its existence was largely unknown to the public until well into the 21st century. It wasn't until 2013 that the United States government decided to return the archive to Germany. In an official ceremony held in Berlin, more than 400 boxes containing tens of thousands of original documents were handed over. The return of the archive represented an act of historical justice and allowed German historians direct access to materials essential to understanding the ideological machinery of the Third Reich. Since then, the archive has been in the custody of the German Federal Archives and is partially available to researchers. The archive's contents range from philosophical treatises written by Rosenberg, with his vision of a Europe dominated by the Aryan race, to reports on Nazi administrative structures in Eastern Europe. It also includes correspondence with other Nazi leaders, such as Himmler and Bormann, as well as records of cultural plunder in France, Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. The richness and variety of the documentation make the archive an indispensable source for understanding how Nazism combined ideology, politics, and crime into a single totalitarian structure. Stolen brilliance jewels confiscated from Jewish families. One of the cruelest and most systematic aspects of Nazi persecution was the economic dispossession of European Jews. Even before their deportation to concentration or extermination camps, Jewish families were subjected to a perfectly structured machinery of plunder, which included the confiscation of homes, bank accounts, works of art, and, in particular, jewelry. These valuables, which in many cases were family heirlooms, symbols of identity, or simple guarantees of security in the face of an uncertain future, were seized by the regime and dispersed through state and private channels. Since the first anti-Semitic laws in Germany in 1933, and with particular intensity after Kristallnacht in 1938, the Nazi apparatus perfected legal mechanisms to justify looting. So-called asset declarations required Jewish citizens to register every valuable possession. What began as a bureaucratic control eventually became a basis for legalized theft. Jewelry such as rings, necklaces, watches, brooches, gold pieces, or precious stones was confiscated by the Gestapo, the SS, or the Ministry of Economics, which melted them down, sold them on the market, or stored them as Reich reserves. During deportation to the camps, prisoners were stripped of their belongings at train stations, transit centers, or upon arrival at their final destination. At Auschwitz and other extermination camps, records show that jewelry was systematically collected, sorted, and shipped to Berlin. Often the objects were hidden by their owners among clothing or seams in a last-ditch attempt to preserve something of their own. The Nazis knew this, and later forensic records show how even gold teeth were opened from corpses to extract every last ounce of treasure. After the collapse of the Third Reich, a significant amount of this jewelry was recovered by Allied forces. Much of it was stored in secret depots such as the salt mines in Merkers, Thuringia, where the US military discovered tons of stolen gold, money, and art. However, most of the loot was never located. The jewelry, being easily transportable, was also looted by soldiers, trafficked on the black market, or melted down to erase its origin. For decades, the restitution of this property was a slow and piecemeal process. In some cases, surviving Jewish families were able to identify and claim specific pieces that had belonged to their ancestors. But most of the objects bore no markings that would allow them to be traced, and many post-war administrations showed little interest in expediting returns. It was only in the 1990s that more serious international efforts developed, driven by organizations such as the World Jewish Congress and the Washington Accords on Holocaust-looted property. In recent years, several European museums have been embroiled in controversy for housing jewelry or valuable objects without clear documentation of their provenance. Scandals have also multiplied involving auction houses offering pieces with possible origins in Nazi looting. In some cases, the pieces have been withdrawn from circulation and returned to Jewish families or institutions, although the process remains slow, complex, and often frustrating. The jewelry confiscated from Jewish families is not merely an object of material value. It bears silent witness to a systematic policy of annihilation that began with the denial of civil rights and ended in physical extermination. In their beauty and fragility, these pieces encapsulate stories of loss, uprooting, and violence, but also of memory, justice, and in some cases reparation. Today, each recovered ring, each identified necklace, represents a small act of reconstruction in the face of a history that Nazism attempted to erase with brutal precision. The indelible painting, the official portrait of Hitler, painted by Heinrich Kneer. At the heart of the iconography of the Third Reich, the figure of Adolf Hitler occupied a sacred place. He was depicted in sculptures, prints, films, and especially in paintings that sought to perpetuate his image as a strong, serene, and almost messianic leader. Among these works, one piece in particular stands out: the official portrait of Hitler painted by Heinrich Kneer, one of the most reproduced images of the Führer during the Nazi regime and a work as symbolic as its content. Heinrich Kneer, an academic painter with a conservative tradition, was respected in German artistic circles since the late 19th century. In the 1930s, he was selected to paint the official portrait of Hitler, a task of utmost symbolic importance. The result was a sober painting with a reverential tone. Hitler appears frontally, dressed in a brown Nazi party uniform without gesticulation or affectation, looking slightly off-frame with a rigid and melancholic expression. The neutral background, dim lighting, and centralized composition reinforce the intention of immortalizing him as an almost timeless authority figure. The portrait was adopted as the official image of the Führer in schools, government offices, barracks, police stations, and even private homes. Thousands of copies were printed, and during the heyday of the Third Reich, it was common to find it framed on desks and at home altars, sometimes accompanied by Nazi flags and symbols. The work was also exhibited at the Haus der Deutschen, Kunst, the House of German Art in Munich, the center of official Nazi art, where it was celebrated as an example of new German classicism. But with the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, many of these works were destroyed by German civilians trying to erase all traces of their complicity, or by Allied troops requisitioning propaganda items. The original Kneer portrait, however, survived. It was confiscated by American soldiers in April 1945 during the looting of one of Hitler's residences, possibly the Berghof, or a regime art repository. From then on, the painting's fate remained unclear for decades. In the post-war years, the portrait remained under the protection of the United States government. Some reports indicate that it was transferred to the headquarters of the Office of Strategic Services, while others suggest it was stored alongside other seized cultural property. It was not until the beginning of the 21st century that it was confirmed that the original painting was in the possession of the United States Army, specifically in a military storage facility in Washington. Despite pressure from some academic and museum sectors for its public display as a historical document, US authorities have been reluctant to allow its circulation. They fear that the work could be used as a symbol by neo-Nazi groups or interpreted as a form of aesthetic legitimization of the regime. For this reason, to this day, Kneer's portrait remains hidden from the public, and its display is strictly limited to the scope of research. In contrast, some of the surviving copies of the portrait in Europe have occasionally appeared at private auctions, generating controversy and, in many cases, being withdrawn due to public pressure. The World That Wasn't, the secret maps of the Wehrmacht. During World War II, the Nazi military apparatus relied on a highly sophisticated logistical and cartographic structure. The secret maps of the Wehrmacht, the regular army of the Third Reich, were fundamental tools for planning invasions, occupations, troop movements, fortification construction, and covert operations. These maps, many of them classified as secret command matters, represented not only precise geographical information but also the vision of the world the regime planned to conquer and transform. German cartographic production during wartime reached extraordinary precision and volume. Departments of the OKH, the Army's High Command, designed detailed maps ranging from the coasts of Normandy to the Urals, from North Africa to the Balkans. These maps were not simple topographical representations. They included data on railway infrastructure, road quality, supply points, enemy emplacements, mined areas, and even ethnic distribution and natural resources. Cartography was also an instrument of domination. In the occupied territories, the Wehrmacht and the SS used maps to reorganize spaces according to the interests of the Reich. Some versions featured Germanized city names or eliminated local cultural references. Others were used to design the logistics of the Holocaust. They indicated transport routes to concentration camps, distances between ghettos and railway junctions, and even detailed maps of the camps themselves. These cold, technical representations contributed to the destruction carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. Many of these maps were destroyed by the Nazis themselves at the end of the war, aware of their strategic value and their potential use as evidence. However, thousands of copies survived and were captured by Allied forces, primarily the United States and the United Kingdom. American troops recovered large cartographic archives from bunkers, abandoned trains, and empty ministries. In many cases, the maps were neatly filed and classified by region, facilitating their later study. After the war, these documents were incorporated into Western military archives. In the United States, part of the cartographic collection was used by the CIA and the Department of Defense during the Cold War. The information contained in the German maps proved useful for understanding Eastern European infrastructure, Soviet geography, and even for assessing potential conflict scenarios. Others were given to academic institutions or deposited in university libraries. In Germany, some maps reappeared decades later, stored in forgotten archives or in the possession of former officers. In recent years, digitization and historical restitution projects have made it possible to recover and study these materials for scientific purposes. The Bundesarchiv and other agencies have worked to make thousands of these maps available to the public, and they are now used in research on conflict, historical memory, and the representation of space in totalitarian regimes. Wehrmacht secret maps are today pieces of extremely high documentary value. They not only illustrate the Third Reich's military capabilities, but also its vision of the territorial, racial, and political order it sought to impose on Europe. They are tangible evidence of how a criminal regime drew lines across the world with the intent of total domination. Curiously, some of these maps have also reached the military collector's market. Although they are not illegal like other Nazi artifacts, their buying and selling raise ethical concerns, especially when not historically contextualized. Every line on these maps, every marked road or shaded area, is associated with decisions that cost millions of lives. Blood and gold, the recovery of Nazi gold from the Reichsbank. Few images symbolize the plunder and ambition of the Third Reich as much as the mountains of bullion, coins, and jewels amassed by the Reichsbank, the central bank of Nazi Germany. Under the direction of Walter Funk and in coordination with the SS, the Reichsbank became the financial heart of the war and extermination machine. There, in underground vaults, gold stolen from occupied countries, national banks, Holocaust victims, and entire populations wiped out by the expanding Reich was stored. During the war, the German economy suffered constant inflationary pressure due to massive military spending. To sustain the war effort and stabilize the Deutsche Mark, the regime resorted to the systematic plundering of foreign reserves. As Germany invaded countries, it confiscated the gold deposits of their central banks. Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Italy, and others saw their reserves evaporate in a matter of days. It is estimated that between 1939 and 1945, more than 550 tons of gold were illegally transferred to the Reichsbank, but it wasn't just state gold. Beginning in 1942, the Nazis began receiving and melting down gold stolen from concentration camp victims. Teeth, rings, watches, medals, and other metal belongings were collected, melted down, and transformed into unmarked ingots known as gold without history. Reports from the Nuremberg trials indicate that the Reichsbank even kept boxes labeled dental gold, clear evidence of its direct link to the genocide. The gold was centralized in Berlin and then redistributed according to the regime's needs. Some of it was used for international payments, primarily with neutral countries such as Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, and Portugal, in exchange for strategic raw materials. These transactions generated intense controversy after the war and led to investigations that are still ongoing today. As the Allies advanced toward the end of the war, the gold was dispersed and hidden in various locations throughout the Reich. One of the most famous discoveries took place in April 1945, when American soldiers discovered a vast stash of Nazi gold in a salt mine in Merkers, Thuringia, more than 100 tons of bullion and coins along with artwork, banknotes and documents. The discovery was so shocking that it triggered a high-profile operation to secure the site, even involving General Eisenhower himself. After the war, the recovered gold was transferred to the Tripartite Commission for the Restitution of Monetary Gold, formed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. This body was to distribute the gold among the countries plundered by the Reich, although restitution was partial and often symbolic. Not all the gold was returned, and large quantities remained under Allied control or disappeared in the post-war chaos. The shadow of Nazi gold looms large to this day. In the 1990s, international pressure and revelations from journalistic investigations forced Switzerland and other countries to acknowledge their role in recycling Nazi gold. The Bergier report, published by the Swiss government in 1998, confirmed that some of the gold melted down by the Reichsbank had entered its banks via the Swiss National Bank. Since then, compensation funds for Holocaust victims have been established, but there is still a long way to go in terms of full justice. Evil wears Prada. What happened to Hitler's personal uniform? Adolf Hitler's personal uniform was much more than a piece of clothing. It was a carefully designed symbol to project authority, discipline, and the ideal of the charismatic leader. From his early years as leader of the Nazi Party until his suicide in April 1945, Hitler adopted a militarized aesthetic that helped reinforce his public image and his control over the regime's machinery. The uniform Hitler wore in public and at official events consisted of a light brown jacket, dark trousers, and black leather boots. Across his chest, he wore the Iron Cross First Class, a medal earned in World War I, reaffirming his status as a veteran and patriot. A red armband bearing the Nazi swastika on his left arm completed the ensemble, as did the characteristic imperial eagle insignia on his chest. Throughout his career, Hitler commissioned several uniforms from elite tailors, some custom-made, others more modest, depending on the context. The design avoided excessive ostentation so as not to stray from the man-of-the-people ideal he promoted. However, certain elements were reserved for special events, such as more elaborate uniforms with gold embroidery, white gloves, and command batons for official ceremonies and military parades. After the war, the fate of Hitler's personal uniform was mixed. It is known that some of his outfits were recovered by Allied soldiers from the Berlin bunker or from residences such as the Berghof, his retreat in the Bavarian Alps. Many garments were taken as souvenirs or displayed in military and contemporary history museums, although over time several disappeared or were destroyed to prevent them from becoming cult objects for neo-Nazi sympathizers. One of the most iconic uniforms is currently in the custody of the Imperial War Museum in London, where it is displayed within a rigorous historical context that seeks to avoid glorifying the figure. Some pieces are also preserved at the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, a German institution dedicated to the critical study of Nazism. Secondary education. Asia. The cost of the Nazi train that is considered a beastly relic during World War II, Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe and a prominent figure in the Third Reich, operated a special train known as the Sonderzug Asien. This convoy served not only as a means of transport but also as a mobile headquarters and a symbol of his status within the Nazi regime. In fact, all high-ranking Nazis had their own trains, known as Sonderzugs, or special railways, the best known of which was the one used by Hitler, the Führer-Sonderzug. However, what sets Göring's train apart from those of other important National Socialist Party officials is that a large part of his special train has been preserved. The code name Asien, which designated Göring's train, was used from 1 September 1939 to 31 January 1943. Subsequently, from 1 February 1943, the train was renamed Pommern 1, while an auxiliary train for personnel and vehicles was given the name Pommern 2E. The Sonderzug Asien consisted of approximately 15 cars, although their exact configuration varied according to requirements. Prominent components included air defense cars, or Flakwagen, which were located at both ends of the train, equipped with anti-aircraft guns for protection against both small aircraft and bombers. There were also generator cars, which provided electrical power to the train when it was stationary, ensuring the operation of essential systems. Next came the lounge and bedroom cars, which included Göring's main lounge, staff bedrooms and rest areas. The dining car, or Salonspeiswagen, was luxurious and featured 2 dining rooms and a kitchen decorated with fine woods and equipped with modern appliances for its time. Of course, as one of the Reich's most important generals, the Sonderzug Asien included a conference car, which also served as a mobile command center and was typically used for strategic meetings and military planning. It also included instruments such as radios, maps, and other military communication and planning tools. Finally, the train also featured a restroom car, a press car, and other functional spaces, reflecting the importance of mobility and comfort to the Third Reich's high-level operations. The Sonderzug Asien served multiple purposes, the primary one being to serve as a mobile headquarters during the war's darkest hours, allowing Göring to oversee military operations and make strategic decisions while moving through occupied territories. As mentioned above, Göring had a deep love of opulence, luxury, and art, so his train also served as a transport for looted art. The Sonderzug was used to move confiscated artwork and valuables from occupied Europe, as well as other goods such as gold and silver coins and ingots. Eventually, Hitler decided to implement these special trains as a symbol of power. The train's opulence reflected Göring's status within the Nazi regime, serving as an extension of his public image. The train made frequent trips between Berlin and Göring's headquarters, known as the Jägerhof, located near Rastenburg in East Prussia. It was also used for visits to battle fronts and for other official missions. With the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, the fate of the Sonderzug Asien became uncertain. Some of its cars were captured by Allied forces, while others were reused or dismantled in the years following the war. One of the air raid defense cars was identified in Delitzsch, Saxony, and subsequently converted into an ambulance car for the state railway of the German Democratic Republic in the 1970s. Despite efforts to trace and preserve parts of the train, much of its original structure has been lost or remains unaccounted for. Nevertheless, the Sonderzug Asien remains a testament to the Nazi regime's use of railway infrastructure for military, logistical, and propaganda purposes. Indelible ink. The discovery of Hitler and Ava Browns' diaries. The diaries of Adolf Hitler and Ava Braun provide a rare and fascinating window into the personal lives of the Führer and his partner, whose relationship was marked by discretion, isolation, and the drama surrounding the final years of the Third Reich. Although both maintained a controlled public life, their private writings, always coveted by historians, researchers, and collectors, have provided essential details about their thoughts, emotions, and everyday life in a turbulent historical context. Ava Braun, born in 1912, entered Hitler's life in the 1920s and remained his companion for almost 2 decades, until their joint suicide in April 1945. However, she always remained in the shadows, far from visible power and the political scene. Her diaries, letters, and personal photographs, in which she captured her feelings, activities, and worldview, were recovered after the war from the bunkers and residences where they lived. Hitler's writings, on the other hand, are much more scarce and fragmentary, as his life was dominated by the need to control his public image and maintain an inflexible leadership profile. However, some personal notes, drafts, and diaries survive, revealing little-known aspects of his personality, from his reflections on art, politics, and war to moments of doubt, irritation, and obsessions. After the fall of the Reich, numerous personal documents were looted, destroyed, or dispersed. Ava Browns' diaries, in particular, fell into the hands of Allied officers and intelligence agents who understood their value in unraveling the psychology of Hitler and his entourage. Over the years, fragments have appeared in archives and private collections, sparking debates about their authenticity and the right to disclose them. Some of these writings are currently housed in museums and historical archives, such as the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich and the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library. D. Roosevelt in the United States. In both cases, the exhibition focuses strongly on the historical context, avoiding any attempt at romanticization or justification. The diaries reveal an Ava Braun who longed for a normal, simple life, far from politics, yet caught in the maelstrom of a totalitarian regime. Her writings reveal her concern for Hitler's health, her boredom in the bunker, and her mixture of loyalty and despair in his final days. Hitler's writings, on the other hand, reveal a mind obsessed with the war and the fate of Germany, but also with the preservation of his own legacy. In recent years, the digitization and controlled publication of these diaries have opened new avenues for academic research and debate, albeit with caution to avoid sensationalism. Access to these writings has also allowed for a critical look at how personal history is intertwined with the political and social history of an era.